Chris Vacarro, who teaches courses on Tolkien and Beowulf at the University of Vermont. He has published articles and edited essay collections on Tolkien's Legendarium. He is currently co-editing a volume entitled Queering Tolkien and deep inside a project titled Sadomasochistic Beowulf. What a title. Welcome, Chris. Over to you.
Need to do something? Yes. Now it's on? Okay, yeah, that does sound like it's on. Okay, good. It's definitely appropriate to say now for something completely different. All right, so I added a little bit to the title because I'm making this paper even more complicated than it needs to be continuously. So, and Númenor went down into the sea, Tolkien, Beowulf, and the masochistic jouissance of Westernesse, and Adain is being beaten. So, Adain, sorry, that is being beaten. So, all right. And where do I point this? This way? Okay, good. So I want to at least do one thing, which was to define jouissance, an ego-shattering pleasure beyond the pleasure principle and experience of death or the death drive. So a pleasure that's a super simplification, right? But this kind of almost ego-shattering, psyche-shattering pleasure, right, that we have here. So, in masochistic experience, every bit of flesh comes alive in the agony of trembling ecstasy. All is sensitized almost beyond endurance. How can it not be sexual? How can it not be religious? One is taken out of oneself and beyond all law and duty and custom, and yet utterly reduced, pressed down, made small. It is a defeat and a glory. Lynn Cohen, masochism. We will get to all of these things shortly. 1936, Tolkien writes Beowulf the Monster and the Critics. In it, he argues many significant points, perhaps the most important of which concerns the central theme of Beowulf, humanity's engagement with death, its mortality, a struggle with its place in a hostile world. It is a theme significant to Tolkien as well. Tolkien wrote of it in The Fall of Númenor and in The Lost Road. Of course, he's writing these at the same time as he's working on his Monsters and Critics essay, right? So he's got very much Beowulf on the brain as he's working on this. Almost 20 years later, Tolkien addresses his reoccurring personal dream in his 1955 letter to W.H. Auden, where he describes the ineluctable wave either coming out of the quiet sea or coming and towering over the green islands. The event is spiritual and highly emotional, this great wave scene, right? And I'm going to suggest today equally erotic. Ilúvatar himself is brought to wrath at the offenses of his mortal children, and in his anger, he rends apart the world, condemning and punishing the Númenorians and submerging both land and people under stone and sea. In Tolkien, Enchantment and Loss, John Rosegrant avers that Tolkien wrote of the destruction of Númenor in order to release a personal emotional complex. I agree with this astute observation. However, I would add to Tolkien's need to narrativize his griefs another psychological catalyst for story. And I could talk a lot about that as well today, but I won't necessarily now. Tolkien's personal and Christian masochism, welcoming a dissolution of the self, what Sigmund Freud would call primary masochism, and Georges Bataille would describe as the human need to return to a greater continuity. I don't know what I have down here. Okay, that's this. We are discontinuous beings, says Georges Bataille, individuals who perish in isolation in the midst of an incomprehensible adventure, but we yearn for our lost continuity, along with our tormenting desire that this evanescent thing should last. There stands our obsession with a primal continuity linking us with everything that is. So one thing that it's sort of behind all this is the idea that the bigger the ego, in some ways, the greater the hubris, the more terrified you are of death, but the more you are intrigued by it. The more there's a kind of pleasure that comes with the imagination of your ego being, however briefly or permanently, extinguished, right? That there's a kind of pleasure that comes with that, and the release of a burden. The Beowulf poem renders conspicuous the dependency of early medieval English male subjectivity on experiences of masochistic desire and the death drive, the will to be unburdened by great expectation and responsibility, a burden, admittedly, many only dream of having. I will make the case that Tolkien's close relationship to the Beowulf poem primed the pump of his literary artistry when it came to stories of failure and eroticized submission, such as the fall of Númenor, allowing for the author and readers alike to experience the erotic thrill of the All-Father's punishments and the Akelabeth. My methodology is quite often associated with the subject at hand. An intelligent choice, of course, is source studies, where one is quickly drawn to Plato's dialogues. The book of Genesis is clearly inspirational here, as well and testifies to, as Brian Sibley aptly describes, the Judeo-Christian narrative of the frailty and fallibility of mankind. Beowulf seems a less obvious choice, perhaps, since as much as the sea is central to the nascence and success of the masculine hero and a powerful link to the threat of the now monstrous female, there is no deluge, no ineluctable wave, no immediately recognizable watery punishment for Beowulf's failings. Actually, its link to the Akelabeth lies in the deep waters of the psyche, in the psychology of the two texts, and it is there that we will soon turn. Tolkien deliberately created his own mythology, and so it behooves us to read his legendarium through the kaleidoscopic lens that the many schools of psychology today form. In doing so, we are in good company. Appropriately, Tolkien scholars employ concepts by Carl Jung, Julia Kristeva, Sigmund Freud, Jacques Lacan, among others. The Individuated Hobbit, for example, examines the legendarium through Jung's cultural theory discourse. From the ineluctable wave to the realization of imagined wonder, John Rosegrant employs the concept of transitional experience, of experiencing oneself as me or as not me, proposed by psychologist D.W. Winnicott. Reading through Tolkien's letters for glimpses into the author's memories, Rosegrant is convinced that, quote, the Atlantis wave complex symbolized Tolkien's passive surrender to overwhelming impersonal force. Those memories render an image of a man often feeling alone, Rosegrant says. The one figure that loomed large in his mind, however, was his father. The memories, quote, the memories of his father and of the voyage all concern the time of separation from his father. This cluster of memories indicates that Tolkien's loss of his father was a major organizer of his emotions. Dr. Christine Larson further contributes to our attempt at pulling together a composite picture of the wave complex, reminding readers that, quote, dreaming of a tsunami means you are dealing with overwhelming feelings in your life and that you are trying to keep bottled up or consciously, feelings in your life that you are trying to keep bottled up either consciously or subconsciously. While scholars have rightly investigated dreams and archetypes, complexes, traumas, and theories of sexuality, the use of theories around sadomasochism in Tolkien studies has gone relatively unexamined, despite its centrality to human sexuality and its prominent place within the field of psychology. In this area of study, while texts of Jacques Lacan, Gilles Deleuze, Kaja Silverman are truly inspirational, Freud comes to mind first when it comes to the death drive, the primary masochism, a part of everybody's psychology, according to Freud. Theories suggest that as members of Western culture, we are in some ways aroused by displays of power and power discrepancies. And we eroticize submission to power, our submission, someone else's, both. In his A Child is Being Beaten, Freud argues that there are three phases that seem to bring individuals to this particular sadomasochistic fantasy. My first caveat is that the imagery of the essay is clearly more severe than we would encourage today. Firstly, a father spanks his child. His other child, whose fantasy this is, witnesses their sibling being beaten, taking it to mean that they are loved more than the punished sibling with whom they have some rivalry. This love is erotically charged. My father is beating the child whom I hate. Other surrogates, and so there's a kind of a reification of one's ego through that. Other surrogates can substitute, of course, for that sibling. In the second phase, the first child wishes that they were receiving this affection themselves. Through a pre-genital libidinal position, feelings of guilt and regression steer the initial sadistic pleasure inward, back toward the self. So they're getting there's a kind of arousal. My, younger brother is getting spanked. And that kind of sadistic kind of pleasure is turned around upon the self. I wish that were me. I wish I were the one getting that attention, even if it's a spanking. What Freud called a kind of secondary masochism. So the primary masochism is our death drive, right? There's so much of that. We send that out into the world as far in a way of sadistic energy, but not all that sadistic energy is brought out into the world. Some of it comes back to us, right, in this sort of secondary masochism. As Freud acknowledges here for the first time, quote, we have the essence of masochism, end quote. The third phase, then, is a sexual charged awareness of the libidinal and sadistic fantasy of watching others being punished. Though seemingly sadistic, the pleasure fits a masochistic pleasure, as the fantasizing child experiences vicariously what the punished child feels, and it fulfills an edible, read sexual urge as they imagine themselves being beaten. Importantly, other punishments suffice in this process as well, right? So it's generally speaking the punishment, right, and being punished, right? That is a major feature of, let's say, most BDSM scenes. Okay. So the fantasy emerges through the sense of the authority figure punishing the child or its surrogate. So according to Freud, many of us to some degree want to participate in the scene whereby the symbolic father figure scolds someone else. These scenes of punishment elicit both sadistic and masochistic pleasures. We would not so quickly locate today power solely in the male, but certainly this is the framework for the Abrahamic religions, including Tolkien's Roman Catholicism. Masochism is, as Lynn Cohen argues, ties closely to the submission and surrender experienced at moments of religious ecstasy. Quote, all masochistic strivings are ultimately directed towards satisfaction, namely towards the goal of oblivion, of getting rid of self with all its conflicts and all its limitations. The authors of different loving concur, arguing submission is a turning away from the social and a penetration into the sacrosanct internal space. This is why, this may be why many submissives compare their erotic experience to a religious or spiritual surrender. The surrender is a means of achieving a kind of freedom from ego, a condition where one is completely trusting and undefensive. In his essay on homoerotic pleasures between medieval knights, Richard Zykowitz considers that a reader may do something similar to the father's child in Freud's essay, manifesting through an emotional investment sadomasochistic pleasures by seeing or imagining the violence between the characters in a medieval romance. Zykowitz argues, quote, the reader identifying now with the beater derives masochistic pleasure by also identifying with the one being beaten. So readers can get involved in these scenes is the gist, right? So readers might imagine the scene and unconsciously experience the shudder of the punishment and identify with perhaps both of the participants, but most likely the one being punished. Furthermore, once punished, we desire to give up control to the highest authority, the father, in this case with Freud, so that we can be taken care of, guided. Of course, this behavior in individuals all right, so this idea of being punished and then guided and sort of adopting this submissive posture. This behavior in individuals in subaltern subject positions of less social agency and personal will would be very problematic if left unexamined. So just that's something to consider. And yet, sadomasochism is said by the likes of Judith Butler to offer potential avenues of scrutiny and resistance to hegemonic systems of power dispensation. The entire process is part of a masochistic process of self-dissolution that is erotic. The question I pose for you today asks, to what degree is this useful to reading Tolkien? That's my big, that's where I'm at right now with all this. Before doing so, I want to take a cue from Tolkien's favorite Old English poem, Beowulf, because I think that's very influential in 1935, 1936, 1937, as Tolkien's also working on the story that's been occupying us today. Where am I with this? Good, we get it. All right, so such scenes of submission and domination are not alien to the Beowulf poem. In fact, there are a number of situations where such erotic pleasures are accentuated. In Language, Sign, and Gender, Gillian Overing maintains that Beowulf, quote, seems to be a poem about death, how to die, how to seek out death, how to meet it head on, end quote. And the poem exposes the proximity of death and dying to the discourse of heroism, how one may come to accept, perhaps even welcome with agitation, the coming of death. And make sure I have, okay, go. Beowulf is also very much about emotional interactions between men. There is love there, deeply rooted affection at times, wound together with sociality and obligation, and there is aggression, submission, domination, erotic in varying degrees in the court, in the public, in the domestic spaces, and even on the battlefield, right? We have to imagine the battlefields are very much about conquest, about love, about grief, about retribution and obligation, about submission and domination. And some of those are erotically charged submissions and domination of others. As I argue, anyway, in my warlike grip essay, a yearning for an experience of continuity of being, the very fabric of masochistic jouissance is integral to the culture of Beowulf. One scene in particular, that in which Beowulf kills the hero Dayraven through a deadly embrace, serves to illustrate my point. Just as with Zeikowitz's model, a reader may imagine himself caught up in the beatings between knights. A reader may take a scene such as Beowulf's juridic slaying of Dayraven and incorporate such into his or her fantasies. The listener, reader of the poem may vicariously experience the pleasurable pain inflicted by Beowulf's powerful arms tightening around the chest until both consciousness and selfhood of Dayraven dissolve into a greater continuity. The men of Beowulf are involved in an erotic embrace with death. Sometimes this embrace quite literally arrives to the arms of the most beautiful and most powerful of men, the heroic ideal. To die by the incomparable press of arms and chest of such an exemplary figure as Beowulf requires little erotic amplification. A reader or listener of the poem, longing to enjoy the bliss and freedom of submission, might easily identify, as even Beowulf himself might, with Dayraven, and imagine in his unique and very public defeat the sweet agony of such a loss of selfhood. So that little part was from my essay on warlike grip. So the essence of that segment is, who's your daddy? Okay, so it's Beowulf in this case. All right, we're getting to the big daddy, as you can imagine. All right, sorry. Okay, Beowulf articulates the jouissance of losing. As Tolkien himself argues in The Monster and the Critics, Beowulf is about failure. The fall of man is, quote, an ancient theme, that man, each man and all their works shall die, end quote. Tolkien's pertinent points in the lecture is the poem is a tragedy and in ways a lament. Humankind continues to fight, displaying its indomitable will, but failure is inevitable, but not acknowledged or acquiesced to. And that's an interesting thing to think about also later. That is what Beowulf expresses, humanity's constant fight against mortality, against forces more powerful, and the ultimate defeat. It is in Beowulf, he says, that a poet has devoted a whole poem to the theme, defeat, inevitable, yet unacknowledged, and has drawn the struggle in different proportions so that we may see man at war with the hostile world and his inevitable overthrow in time. To be human is to fail, to ultimately surrender to the divine. This failure may be part of our greater tragedy, as Tolkien suggests, but this doesn't mean that there isn't something satisfying about it. In fact, there is something in the humility and in the submission to the divine that provides a deep psychological and spiritual pleasure. Oops, yeah, okay. Take, for example, if I bring this up, yes. In King Hrothgar's homiletic speeches, we have this moment in which the poet displays a readiness, if not a rush, towards the psychic oblivion that death represents, referring to something very similar to the Akelabeth. And there is something we could speak about the eschatological sort of principles here. Hrothgar will say, too soon it will be that sickness or the sword will shatter your strength, or the grip of fire, or the surging flood, or the cut of a sword, or the flight of a spear, or terrible old age, or the light of your own eyes will fail and flicker out in one fell swoop. Death, oh warrior, will overwhelm you. Howell Chickering makes perhaps the most eloquent summarization of the poem's masochistic jouissance when describing the scene. The organ tone, all stops pulled out, in which Hrothgar thunders home his point about the inescapability of death, is rhetorical, not dramatic. It invites a pleasant shudder. What is that shudder? Right? I feel like there's a pleasurable shudder in there as well. It's not just fear. Yes, death is inevitable and will level us all, even the hero. Why, look at old Hrothgar himself. Why, look even at me. So now we're going to get to in the last minute or two of the Akelabeth. The downfall of Númenor, the Akelabeth, is a composition testifying to humanity's fall from grace. In it, we perceive submission to the punishment of the All-Father, right? I'll remind you, that's what Ilúvatar means, right? In his letter to Christopher Bretherton, Tolkien writes, in sleep I had the dreadful dream of the ineluctable wave, either coming out of the quiet sea or coming in, towering over the green inlands. It still occurs occasionally, though no exercise by writing about it. It always ends by surrender, and I awake gasping out of deep water. In the Silmarillion, Tolkien provides a passage of the scene. The power of the father is conspicuous even when Tolkien distances Ilúvatar from the destruction of Númenor by using the passive voice, right? And maybe this is because maybe our faithful didn't want to make him seem such like a tyrannical, despotic figure, all right, by doing this. So, you know, they, oh, well, nice effect. Okay, but I change the passive voice to active, or, you know, I put the subject back in the sentence, right, so that we have this. So the switch to passive voice underscores the relationship, as we can see if we add the subject back to its place in the sentence. The scene creates a shudder and thrill to all who are subject to such divine wrath. But Ilúvatar showed forth his power, and he changed the fashion of the world, and a great chasm he opened in the sea between Númenor and the Deathless lands, and the waters flowed down into it, and the noise and smoke of the cataracts went up into heaven, and the world was shaken by Ilúvatar, and all the fleets of the Númenorians were drawn down into the abyss by Ilúvatar, and they were drowned and swallowed up forever by Ilúvatar. Númenor was utterly destroyed by Ilúvatar, for it was nigh to the east of the great rift, and its foundations were overturned by Ilúvatar. And it fell and went down into darkness and is no more. In Splintered Light, Verlin Flieger remarks that Middle-earth must be seen as a place of defeat and disappointment, and man must be seen as born to trouble. I love her. Trouble is our legacy. Like the men in Tolkien's Beowulf, the men of Númenor fight against evil with unyielding will, and ironically become base and evil over time. They see hostility both in nature and in the divine, and that sort of steered me to start thinking about, you know, how they're more like the Danes in Beowulf, and I can't go there today right now, but or there's two, anyway, So, conclusion stuff. A masochistic unpleasure is, of course, central to a Christian worldview. In his letter to his son, Michael Tolkien, in his letter to his son, Michael, Tolkien points out that it is not, pace slavoi zizek, from enjoyment that humanity will regain its stature. Quote, the essence of a fallen world is that the best cannot be attained by free enjoyment, but by denial and suffering. Zizek argues that in the late 20th and early 21st century culture, individuals have the onerous burden placed upon them to enjoy everything, right? That's sort of our masochistic sort of cross to bear, if you will. And I might add everything, everywhere, and if possible, all at once, right? It is sort of where we're at with things. Submission to God is, in Beowulf and in the Akelabeth, accompanied by a masochistic pleasure in agony, a humbling of the self, an ego-shattering experience whereby pleasure is derived through a return to a greater continuity. This is a juridical action where punishment is meted out to fit the transgression, the greatest of crimes, hubris. Death by water is the fit judgment here, as it was for Saruman, right? For pride. So basically, yes, what I'm saying today is that the Akelabeth is the most significant spanking scene in Middle-earth, with the father being none other than Eru Iluvatar himself, the All-Father. The downfall of Númenor evinces not only a sorrow and a fear of God, but also a trembling and queer pleasure one could accurately label as masochistic. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Are there any other events in Middle-earth where you could apply this reading?
Great question. I mean, now that I'm thinking about and have been for the past maybe 6-8 weeks about, you know, this sort of masochistic jouissance, then you can find it in so many places. I mean, even to think about, you know, our Pharazon, right, and the death wish, right? Because it is paradoxical and ironic, right? That, and as we've been saying today, is someone who sees themselves as so beyond the law would simultaneously want to prove to themselves they're beyond the law by stepping foot on that shore. But also, if Freud is right here, would simultaneously enjoy a kind of extinguishing of his ego, right? And the burden of that ego. That extinguishing for however long, that dispersal of the psyche is pleasurable. So right there, I mean, I could think of our Pharazon, I could think of the death drive there. And then, I mean, I invite everyone to think about, like, you know, where might we see the death wish, right? The death instinct in Middle-earth. I am just beginning to tackle this, so I don't have a lot yet. Maybe there's a kind of longer project here, because I have been working with this in Beowulf. Yeah, there's probably a number of places. You know, we think about even Frodo, right? And we talked about his trauma and the PTSD and the trauma of soldiers. And again, definitely respecting that position, that experience, right? And the trauma that goes behind all of that, and not knowing much about it firsthand, obviously. But that also sense of, if human beings with a psyche, with an ego, you know, have at any level a degree of a desire for that extinguishing of the ego, right? Then there's something there even on the battlefield with soldiers. And I think I talk about this with Beowulf, right? So we can look in the direction of soldiers and warriors, Faramir, and all of our soldiers.